start with politics because in a major speech in January this year, the Prime Minister said he would halve inflation, grow the economy, lower national debt, shorten NHS waiting times and stop asylum seekers crossing the Channel on small boats.
And now, today, again, we're seeing talk of spring tax cuts, including ditching the dreaded inheritance tax, all in order to smooth over voters.
So, when looking back at Rishi Sunak's 5 pledges, how many of them has he achieved? Our political correspondent Olivia Artley tells us more.
So I want to make 5 promises to you today. 5 pledges to deliver peace of mind. 5 foundations on which to build a better future for our children and grandchildren.
When Rishi Sunak laid out his 5 pledges in a speech to journalists back in January, it was widely believed in Westminster that he was being unambitious. But 12 months on, and the goals, to halve inflation, grow the economy, cut national debt, cut NHS waiting lists and stop the boats, remain, to a varying extent, unfulfilled. As pledged, inflation has halved this year from a high of 10.7% at the end of last year to around 4% now. But that's the end of the unalloyed good news. Despite Jeremy Hunt's Get Back to Work spring budget, the economy has stubbornly failed to grow. For most of the year, growth has hovered around the 0 mark, meaning we are permanently teetering on the edge of a recession. And there's bad news in the national debt quarter too. Far from falling, economists now suggest that debt is skyrocketing, and the OBR has said that the current trajectory is unsustainable. Meanwhile, NHS waiting lists reached an all-time high of an eye-watering 7.7 million last month, and with demand back to pre-pandemic levels, they don't look set to shrink anytime soon. To compound the problem, NHS nurses and doctors have been striking on and off all year, and doctors at least look set to continue well into 2024. As for stopping the boats, polls suggest that the public believe Sunak has failed on this pledge too. Though that may be a little unfair, the data shows that there's actually been a 30% drop in crossings this year compared to last. It is perhaps hardly a surprising view.
Friend, on that point on foreign courts...
The Conservative Party is in civil war mode over the Rwanda scheme, which looks set to be bogged down in Parliament for many months to come. Meanwhile, Keir Starmer is coming up with his own solutions.
The government's lost control of our borders. I think the way to stop the boats is to smash the criminal gangs that are running the vile trade of putting people in the boats in the first place.
At the start of the year, the Prime Minister asked us to judge him purely on how he delivered on his 5 key pledges. He cleverly gave himself some wiggle room in the run-up to the general election. With the exception of halving inflation, he deliberately didn't set any deadlines. But 12 months on, and with popularity ratings at an all-time low, Sunak is all too aware that time is fast running out. Olivia Artley, GB News.
And Olivia joins us now from Westminster. Olivia, do you foresee a spring election?
Well, that's the question on everyone's lips in Westminster at the moment. The thinking for a long time has been that the Conservatives will wait it out for as long as they can. They are expecting the election to be pretty catastrophic for them, but most Conservative MPs I've spoken to think that if they can hold off until the end of next year, then there is at least a glimmer of hope. The logic behind that is that as the year progresses, inflation will continue to go down, which will ease the cost of living crisis a little bit at least. Interest rates will slowly start to come down over the course of this year, which will take a little bit of pressure off for mortgage holders. But on the other hand, the issue with waiting is that the poll ratings don't seem to be going anywhere. Rishi Sunak's popularity has actually gone down since he got into office a year ago, and the Conservatives as a whole are still hovering around the 20 mark. And there's another school of thought which believes that, well, there's going to be a set of local elections in the spring, and wouldn't it be better for the Conservatives to preempt what's set to be a pretty bruising round of elections and rip off the band-aid with the general election in April or May? And as we were hearing in the news there is some evidence that that might be the way ministers are thinking at the moment. They're talking now about scrapping inheritance tax, something which has been on the books for a long time, but it sounds as though plans are now properly being drawn up. Is that because they are planning to go to the country in May? The other evidence to suggest that could be the case is Jeremy Hunt brought in a big tax-cutting measure in his autumn budget, there's 2p cut to national insurance tax, which will actually make a real difference to the purse strings of the average worker. And interestingly, he tabled emergency legislation to implement that change in January. Normally, tax changes like that would be saved for the start of the tax year in April. But as he's choosing to do it so early with this dramatic piece of emergency legislation, could it be that he is hoping that the general public feels the effects of that change before an election and starts to feel a little bit more warmly to the Conservatives? Rishi Sunak is the only person who can tell us when a general election will be, so the speculation is bound to continue for at least a few months. But generally, the feeling in Westminster is beginning to shift from it's surely going to be the end of the year to it well might be the beginning of the year.
And we should remind ourselves, shouldn't we, that latest polling shows the Tories some 20 points behind Labour. So it's a case of whether these pledges that we're hearing about today, these attempts to woo the younger voters, scrapping inheritance tax as well, are they going to shift the polls in any shape or form?
I mean, we'll have to wait and see. It feels pretty unlikely at the moment. A couple of things that the Conservatives are planning, as well as scrapping inheritance tax, is possibly scrapping stamp duty. Now, there are lots of Conservatives who have said for a long time that stamp duty is a bad tax because it gums up the property market. And the thinking is that it would give first-time buyers a real step up the ladder if stamp duty were to be scrapped. That said, it only applies to houses worth over £425,000, I think it is. So it really is most beneficial to those in London and the South East. Is it really possible at this stage, when they are, as you say, 20 points behind in the polls, for the Tories to whip some sort of a rabbit out of the hat which will turn around their fortunes and win them a general election? Well, maybe, but I don't think scrapping inheritance tax is going to be it.
OK, Olivia Artley, political correspondent, thanks ever so much for your insight. Well, let's get some more insight now, because joining us for his reflections on Rishi Sunak's year as Prime Minister is former editor of the Labour list, Peter Edwards. Peter, it might help if we just sort of go through some of these pledges. But first of all, your overall analysis of what Rishi Sunak has or has not achieved.
Well, he's restored a level of competence in the eyes of his supporters and a level of integrity after the scandals of Boris Johnson and the chaos of Liz Truss. But whether you're on the left or unaligned, you would have to say that he's not making progress on those pledges. So he's clearly a hard-working, decent individual, doesn't drink, but on the core measures like are we richer or poorer than 10 years ago or 5 years ago, are public services improving, our NHS waiting list going up and down, he's struggling on all of these, and particularly on inflation, that is still a problem. OK, but some of these things are out of his control. You know, the pandemic. He wasn't in charge when the pandemic happened. We know all about what happened there. There was a lot of unforeseen problems and the impact that's had on the economy. We've also got the war in Ukraine, which has inevitably affected the UK too. Well, Rishi Sunak was Chancellor, so the second most important person in the country at the time of the pandemic. There was a brief period, and I thought it was very ill-advised, where the Conservatives tried to closely tie inflation in UK with the war in Ukraine. And clearly, the appalling events in Ukraine do have some impact, particularly on the energy market. But actually, the roots of Britain's high inflation, it remains high above the Bank of England target, go back many years. So, for example, we don't grow enough of our own food, or Theresa May sold off our gas reserves. So the inflation crisis is a long time in the making, and sadly, it's a long time to unwind. Because although Rishi Sunak met one of his pledges on inflation, it's still above target. Prices are going up, not down.
Peter, in terms of stopping the boats, which was one of his main pledges and perhaps the most important when it comes to voters, he's not stopped the boats, but he has, of course, halved the number of crossings. Some might argue that's because of the weather. Can we be generous this Christmas and give him a semi-win on that front?
No, I mean, I don't like talking in terms of winning and losing, but obviously that's how pollsters will look at it. So around about 30,000 boats expected to cross this year. We're nearly at the end. There's a suggestion in summer that the peaks and troughs of that are weather-related rather than anything the government does, so bad weather disincentivises crossing. But the other concern, I think, particularly for people in Westminster, is that the Tories have expended a lot of political capital on the Rwanda scheme to send 100 to 200 people to Rwanda, if it ever happens, and boat crossings are around 28,000.
If and when Rishi does get a plane off the ground for Rwanda, how big a victory is that going to be in terms of when it comes to polling day?
Well, to me, it's a catastrophic judgment failure and a catastrophic moral failure because I oppose it deeply as a wrong thing to do, outsourcing our moral responsibilities. But it will be good for him politically. Certain parts of the printed press will like it. It will shore up his support on the Conservative backbenches. And maybe core Tory voters who wouldn't go to Labour but would otherwise stay at home might be tempted out because they'll see that as action on immigration. My criticism of it would be, but the scale of it, as well as being wrong, is so small. 1 to 200 people.
Well, legal migration is a much bigger issue.
Yes, it is, and Labour will have to have a clear answer on that going into the election, because going back to the period when Labour has lost elections in the last 10 to 15 years, social security, immigration and leadership have been the three primary concerns. I think Labour are in a much better position on all of those now, but immigration, quite understandably, is always an issue at election time because of the issue pressure on public services.
It is an issue at election time, but is it a bigger issue than the cost of living and the economy and what's happening with people's mortgages?
Well, I still think it will be a cost of living election because there's that old American phrase, it's the economy stupid, that we're all too polite to say to each other. But even when inflation comes down as it has, people are still paying more in mortgages. Mortgage interest rates will be higher for longer.
But they are coming down, though, right? Mortgage, I think a 5-year fix fell below 4% for the first time in recent days. So people might be starting to feel a lot better off in the coming months.
Well, I think they'll feel worse off rather than better off. And the other point briefly on food. Food inflation is up 30%, 30, in 2 years. The Bank of England target for inflation is 2%. So the thing is, whatever happens the next 12 months, as of today, we're still poorer and we're not going to necessarily make up the ground. So I think that's a real challenge for Conservative spinners.
Is it not the case, though, that with inflation falling, interest rates falling, cost of living going down, that the Tories and Sunak will say, look, don't gamble on Labour because we're heading in the right direction. We're making progress on this. Yes, things are still tough, but we are taking decisive action. Don't gamble on Starmer because you don't know what you're going to get. Is that the kind of attack line that we can expect?
The second part will be, it's always don't gamble on the opposition. I think Keir Starmer's a man of decency and integrity and honesty, but there'll be a lot of mud thrown at his previous career at CPS. But on inflation, remember, prices are not coming down. They're going up at a slower rate.
And I'm not entirely sure that the inflation was within Rishi Sunak's control anyway. I mean, one of the targets of halving inflation... That's a great point. Prime Minister's.
That's a great point. It's 6 or 7 guys or girls in the Bank of England on the Monetary Policy Committee setting the central government base rate has a much bigger impact than anything the Prime Minister can do. So it is down to the Bank of England primarily.
OK.
Great stuff.
Edwards, former editor of the Labour List. Really good to have your thoughts this morning. Thank you so much.
Interesting stuff. It's going to be, whether the Tories are going to, seize the opportunity to say, look, we're doing a good job in inflation, mortgage interest rates are coming down, Bank of England interest rates potentially falling as well. Is it going to be a gamble by taking on Starmer?